Everyone, this video is going to continue our series on the philosophy of mind, but we're going to take a little bit of a detour by looking at computer intelligence and its role within our society more generally, and reflect on a couple ethical issues related to bias and social justice. We're going to start the view by trying to understand an idealistic view that someone might have in regards to the possibilities of outsourcing human thinking or decisions to computers. In order to understand this idealistic view, we'll start by discussing the fallibility of human thought and the hope that computer thinking might be able to improve on those thoughts. And we'll use a case study in arithmetic to give an example of this kind of approach. And that'll lead us into stating what the idealistic and optimistic view about utilizing computer thinking to help us make progress to a healthier society. But then we're going to take a turn. We're going to look at case studies for how computers and AIs have been actually used within the world, and we'll see that the realistic view of how this is used turns out to be very far from the ideal. The case studies we'll look at are Microsoft's Twitter bot Tay, Amazon's recruitment AI that they eventually abandoned, and Northpoint and its AI regarding criminal justice. Then this will lead into two arguments we'll consider: the designer bias argument, the biased data argument, and then we'll consider what, if anything, is the solution to the bias that we see within artificial intelligence. So let's start out by just noting human beings aren't perfect. We are fallible, we make mistakes. So human beings are intelligent. We can think, we can reason, and we can do so about many different topics. We can reason about math, biology, history, physics, poetry, politics, art. And we're also probably more intelligent and better able to understand these kinds of topics than any other kind of creature on this planet. Human intelligence, human beings really are an amazing creature when you think about it. Nonetheless, human beings and human intelligence has its limits. We often make mistakes. And so there's room for improvement on our ability to think about the world around us. Now, in the past video, we've been investigating the possibility of computer intelligence. Turing wants to know if we would be able to create a computer that could mimic or match human intelligence, such that we could better understand what thinking, what thought, what reason is and how it works. Now, as we've said, human intelligence far exceeds that of pretty much all other living creatures on Earth. And this is likely a result of the evolutionary process by which human beings and our brains have been produced. But if the mechanisms by which human thinking takes place is an improvement on the means by which other animals think, this raises the question: could we create other ways of thinking that are even better than the ways that humans are able to think about these topics? And as I mentioned, we were previously considering this possibility of creating computers that can mimic the responses of intelligent human beings, so we can better understand how human beings are able to think, how they achieve that amazing process. But if we can create computers that can think, what if instead of trying to mimic the way that human beings think, we try to create them in ways that improved on our ways of thinking? In fact, this is what most artificial intelligence research these days is. It's not trying to mimic or copy human intelligence. Rather, it's trying to give us a tool that we can use that will improve on our thinking. As an example, human thinking is pretty good at basic arithmetic. So what's 5 plus 3? 8. What's 10 minus 4? 6. 113 plus 17? 130. 5 times 9? 45. 45 divided by 10, 4.5. We are able to answer these questions correctly and pretty quickly, pretty easily. However, we're not quite as good with performing these same operations when they involve slightly larger numbers. What's 18,677 plus 2,179,981? What's 9,567 minus 7,918? What's 1,678 multiplied by 56,754? What's 145,678 divided by 56? Now look, it's going to take you much longer to perform these operations. And even if we slow down in thinking through the operations, we're certainly going to make some mistakes sometimes when performing this kind of thinking. But we can design computers that also perform these same arithmetical operations of addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. And the method we've designed for computers to perform these operations seems to improve on our human thinking about mathematics in at least a few ways. Calculators can perform these operations much more quickly, especially in the latter, more complicated cases. Calculators are also much more reliable at giving the correct answer. And it's for these reasons that we might outsource much of our mathematical thinking to computers. For instance, during tax season, I'm likely to use a calculator to go through and do this arithmetic because I think doing so is going to speed up how quickly I can get my taxes turned in. Moreover, I'm more confident that using the calculator to check my answers is more likely to get the correct answers. Of course, part of the point of Turing is we want intelligent things to be able to think about not just one topic like mathematics, we also want to be able to think about other topics. And so we can start to consider, could we design computers that are not just calculators, but are able to think about many more topics? And we might consider, well, just like arithmetic, could we create computers that don't just mimic human thought, but actually improve on this process such that they could get answers and make decisions about in those other areas in ways that, like arithmetic, is more reliable than the way that humans think about those topics. For instance, we might want to design a computer program that will help us more quickly and reliably identify fraud or plagiarism. For instance, Turnitin.com that can look at repositories of sources throughout the internet much more quickly than I can. Or what if we could comb through numerous resumes, thousands of resumes very quickly to help us figure out who to interview or who to hire for a job? Maybe we could input certain symptoms into a computer and use it to help us diagnose various medical diseases, or to help us decide whether to give surgery to a person or not. What about deciding who to admit to a college or a university? Another thing we have to think about if you're in marketing, if you're in business, is at what price should you sell your product? If you set the price too high, no one will buy it. If you set the price too low, you won't make as much of a profit. Or consider the criminal justice system. We often have to make a decision about how likely do we think this person is to reoffend, as that might affect what kind of sentence we give them for the crime that they committed. So the article we read, it says, the appeal of these computer systems is that they can make impartial decisions, free of human bias. That's the goal, that's the ideal. They're not going to be going off their... Going further, ProPublica, who does not endorse this opinion, tries to get in the mindset of their opposition and explain the appeal of trying to use AI programs within the criminal justice context. They say, the United States locks up far more people than any other country, a disproportionate number of them black. For more than 2 centuries, the key decisions in the legal process, from pre-trial release to sentencing to parole, have been in the hands of human beings guided by their instincts and personal biases. They're going by their gut. If computers could accurately predict which defendants were likely to commit new crimes, maybe on the basis of statistics and mathematical judgments as opposed to a gut feeling that's infused with bias. The idea is that the criminal justice system could then turn out to be fairer and more selective about who is incarcerated and for how long. So this is the goal. This is why someone might be attracted to trying to build these systems to replace human thought in these areas. However, when we consider several real-life cases involving using AI to help us make difficult decisions, you see very quickly that the reality of these systems is very far from living up to the supposed ideal you might have. So let's first consider the example of Microsoft's Twitter bot, Tay. So in March of 2016, Microsoft released an AI Twitter bot named Tay. This AI was designed to learn how to playfully engage with other people, other users on Twitter, and it did so by analyzing data and patterns in the public conversations it had with people on the platform. So the programmers didn't tell Tay how to interact with Twitter users. Rather, they designed the bot to analyze the kinds of things that were being said, the kinds of responses that people gave, which ones got likes, etc., and use that to learn how to engage with other users. The more people on Twitter that had conversations with Tay, the more it was supposed to learn from those conversations about the best ways to engage with other persons on this platform. If you haven't heard about this, given the nature of Twitter, you might already be guessing that this didn't turn out particularly well. Within 24 hours, the bot Tay had learned from these conversations, the data that it was analyzing, how to converse in ways that were racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, transphobic, and hateful posts on Twitter. This wasn't all it posted, but there were many examples of this happening. And by midnight of the same day that the bot went live, Microsoft pulled Tay from the platform. Let's consider another example. Amazon's recruitment AI. In 2014, Amazon started to build an AI in the hopes that it could help the company review resumes and help recruit the best employees. There are oftentimes thousands of resumes to go through. How do you go through those quickly to make sure you're being fair, you're giving everybody a decent shot, and you can quickly find the best candidate for that position? But within a year, the team became aware that the AI seemed to be exhibiting sexist tendencies. Now, it's important to note that the AI was not designed to take gender into account when ranking resumes. It did not collect data on the sex or gender of persons submitting these resumes. Nonetheless, the results, its behavior, seemed to be giving preference to male candidates. And it's because the AI learned to use other data that, even though it isn't about sex or gender, is closely associated with it when it was ranking resumes. Resumes that mentioned clubs or organizations with the word women, women's club, or feminist club, were penalized when it ranked candidates. And obviously, women are more likely to have clubs with the word women in it listed on their resume. It also learned to take resumes of candidates that graduate from women's colleges and rank them lower. And yet again, obviously resumes that have women's colleges listed on them are more likely to come from women. And so Amazon ultimately scrapped the project. You can see Reuters' Amazon scrapped secret AI recruiting tool that showed bias against women, an article, to see the details of how this played out. Let's consider one more example, Northpoint's Compass scores. So Northpoint is a private company, and it's one of several technology companies that attempts to build AI systems aimed at predicting the likelihood that convicted criminals will reoffend in the future. This is known as recidivism. These kinds of systems are increasingly being used within the criminal justice system by judges when they make decisions about appropriate sentencing or whether to grant parole. So they look at the person's record, and they also look at this score of how risky it is to let them out into public when trying to make their decisions about what to do. And these scores are calculated based on answers to survey questions that either come from the defendants themselves or from criminal records. None of these questions in the survey or from the criminal records that the AI is using to give these scores to persons ask about the defendant's race. Nonetheless, ProPublica did an analysis that seemed to reveal racial bias in the scores produced by the AI system. The AI had similar error rates when it made predictions for both black and white defendants. However, the errors went in the opposite direction. The software wrongly predicted reoffending for black defendants, so rated them as riskier, at twice the rate it did so for white defendants. And the software was much more likely to predict that a white defendant had a low risk of reoffending. So what's happening? These AI systems are created to operate on a kind of statistical analysis. They're meant to do the math when looking at the data. And moreover, as I said, they're not actually programmed to take criteria such as race, sex, etc. as part of the data that's input to their calculations. So why are we seeing these AI systems giving rise to these apparently biased behaviors? Someone might say, look, it's just doing the math. It's got to be rational, right? Now, the Vox article we read quotes a statement by Representative Alexandria Cortez giving one explanation for the bias we see in AI systems. Despite the fact that these AI systems are just doing the math, the algorithms for how to do that math are still made by human beings. And those algorithms are still pegged to basic human assumptions. They're just automated assumptions. And if you don't fix the bias in the human beings, then you're just automating the bias that they have. A bit later in the Vox article, it cites Princeton psychologist Alexander Todorov giving a similar but subtly different explanation. He says, "You got the algorithms, which are super powerful, but just as important is what kind of data you feed the algorithms to teach them. If you feed it with crap, it'll spit out crap in the end. Garbage in, garbage out." If we oversimplify and we think of AI algorithms as performing an input-output function, like we did when we were explaining functionalism, Turing, etc., we can see the two places where bias might enter into these kinds of systems. So we have the algorithm. There's an input to this algorithm, and there's an output to this algorithm. Now, what we notice in real-life examples is that the output behavior of these computer systems seems to be biased and seems to engage in prejudicial behavior. And so what we want to explain is, how is that happening? How are we getting this biased output? And it seems like we have two separate explanations for how this can happen. Firstly, that AI algorithm is created by biased human beings. And so the way that it processes that input might inherit the bias of the human beings who created that algorithm. Similarly, we also have the input. Even if the algorithm itself is good, if you give it bad data, if the data itself from the world is biased, then the algorithm will turn that biased input into a still biased output. Garbage in, garbage out. Let's try to turn these ideas into formal arguments. The first is what we'll call the designer bias argument. It claims human beings are biased creatures. Pretty obvious. The second claims that if a designer has biases, then its designs are likely to inherit the designer's biases. Computer programs have been designed by human beings, which, as we've noted, are biased creatures. Thus, the computer programs that they create are likely to inherit those human biases. This is Representative Alexandria Cortez's explanation for why we see bias in these systems. The second argument, the biased data argument, is slightly different. It says, if the data that something uses to learn how to think is biased, then that thing's thinking is likely to be biased as well. Machine learning programs use data about the way the world is to learn how to think. So you give it data from the world and you ask it to analyze that data, notice patterns, and use that to make predictions. The world we live in includes the existence of several bias and prejudices and injustices in the world we have. Therefore, if we just take a machine and say, here's the data from the world, make predictions on its basis, it's going to be getting that biased data and thereby learn how to incorporate those biases into its own thinking. This raises the question, what can we do about this bias? Obviously, we don't want to use computers to perpetuate biases and injustices and inequalities that already exist within our society. In fact, it's especially dangerous because it's harder to see the bias when it's hidden behind a computer screen. Now, here's one suggestion from Aylin Kalisk that's quoted in the Vox article we read. Claims, "We're not suggesting you should remove this information, such as that most nurses have been women and software developers have been men throughout history. So don't blind the machine from that data, because if you take away all that information, it might actually break the software completely." Instead, Kaliskin thinks there needs to be more safeguards. The humans using these programs need to constantly ask, why am I getting these results? And check the output of these programs for bias. They need to think hard on whether the data they are combing is reflective of historical prejudices. So Kaliskin is claiming that the onus, the burden, is on the person using the program to check its results. However, I tend to think that this is probably not going to be enough. But here's some other possible responses to AI bias. Maybe we need these safeguards for assessing the outputs of these programs after the fact, but I'm not sure we should put the onus on any particular one person. Another possibility would be to create entire committees that are used to review these AI systems. But one of the problems with that is oftentimes the information about how these algorithms are making predictions and decisions is proprietary information that's owned by the company that creates them so that they can market their product and someone can't steal their product. And so the public is not able to engage in this kind of check on those systems. So maybe another possibility would be to pass laws that would make it easier for the public to gain information about how those specific AI programs are working. It's also important, we should probably try to attempt to address the policies that lead to systematic prejudices within our own society, such as within our judicial system. For instance, the drug laws we have clearly have a disproportionate impact on the Black community in the United States. And if our data is bad, then AI systems aren't going to improve it. And so we need to fix the data. We need to do what we can to get rid of those systematic injustices in the first place. Moreover, it's probably important to address the diversity problem among the employees within the tech sector, especially within the teams responsible for creating the AI systems itself. So it's not enough just to check the outputs after the algorithms and programs have already been made. But if all the algorithms and AI systems are being made by predominantly white males that have jobs in the tech industry, well, obviously those algorithms are very likely to inherit their biases. So let's take a look at these arguments again and see where you can push. Firstly, you can try to deal with this premise that says human beings are biased creatures. You can try to engage in tactics that would minimize human bias. Secondly, it says if a designer has bias, then its designs are likely to inherit these biases. We could try to deal with this problem by making it less likely that the designs would inherit their designers' biases. We can do that by having a more diverse population responsible for creating the algorithms in the first place. We can also put checks on the system. We can also have review panels on the systems after the fact. What about the biased data argument? Well, there's this machine learning programs use data about the way the world is to learn how to think. Possibility is to curate the information that we present to the AIs when they're learning. Instead of just giving it free rein on the data that's available, we should be very careful at collecting information before we give it to the AI systems that it uses to learn about how to think regarding these topics. And alternatively, if we're going to use data from the real world, well, we want to try to eliminate the bias that exists in that data we're giving the algorithms, and that means addressing the systematic injustices we see in the world prior to the AI systems. That means trying to address the injustices in the ways that our laws are structured, in the ways that our communities are structured, get rid of sort of de facto segregation via sort of redlining of districts, etc. This is a very big issue in the tech industry today. I just wanted to give you a taste that how reflecting on the nature of computer intelligence and how it relates to human intelligence can raise a number of practical questions about how best to incorporate this within our society. That's all for today. See you next time. Bye-bye.